Hi, this is Paul. Ready to Harvest just put out a video a couple of days ago, 3 days ago, about the fact that the PCUSA, the Presbyterian Church of the USA, there's an overture before it that's looking to make refusing to do a same-sex marriage a violation of their order. And the video is mostly about that. This sort of gets into uh, the Reformed Zoomers way of trying to, take the denomination back to conservatism, etc., etc. My interest really isn't in that aspect of this video. My interest is in this earlier comment that he makes and a conversation that this launched for me on CRC Voices and some of the things I learned from the people that I talked to there.
Policy on churches in the denomination. So there are LGBT affirming churches and same-sex.
So he begins by talking about the fact that when it comes to the mainline denominations, now these mainline denominations historically have been the cultural religious center of the culture and the nation. And we've talked quite a bit about the mainline evangelical, that kind of tension. What happened in many of these denominations is that first doing same-sex weddings could become an option, and then as we're seeing in the PCUSA, it will become mandatory. In other words, you cannot bar from it. It's not a point of freedom. It's a point of, well, this is a point of discrimination or no discrimination. In some of the denominations, things are permitted. A lot of this boils down to discipline, which is, of course, where the Christian Reformed Church fight has been happening. So he went through some of this, and then he made this point, which for me was actually the most interesting point of the video.
Sex marriages taking place in their congregations. And that's a good place to begin as we notice a difference in the mainline churches on the topic of sexuality. One thing that's interesting to see in the mainline churches is how that over time they have begun to look more and more similar. When the Presbyterians were staunchly Calvinist and the Methodists staunchly Arminian, there was some tension there. But today, there's people in both groups whose salvation theology is more liberationist or universalist. And on the whole, there's not going to be many arguments between the UMC and PCUSA on this topic. Similarly, the Disciples of Christ's progenitor, Alexander Campbell, wrote a whole book on baptism, Christian baptism with its antecedents and consequence, which heavily criticized infant baptism and baptism by sprinkling or pouring as never done by the authority of God since the world began. However, today this is not an issue for disciples of Christ, who will gladly take into membership an Episcopalian baptized by pouring as an infant without requiring rebaptism. So one is tempted to think that eventually these denominations may look entirely the same. However, there are some things, somewhat overlooked, that seem likely to become more and more important distinctions as time goes on, and church polity is one of the big ones. As I just mentioned, in the American Baptist churches, some churches practice same-sex marriage and others do not, even though there's an official statement in opposition to homosexuality on the books. This is because the American Baptist churches have congregational polity. This is the nearly unanimous way that Baptist denominations operate. What it means is that local churches can elect delegates to go to some kind of convention, which may make statements and set policies for the denomination, but in the end, the highest earthly authority is still the local congregation. If a congregation doesn't want to abide by the policy, there's nobody that can force them to do so. Some Baptist denominations, like the Southern Baptist Convention, will expel a church that strays too far from the doctrinal positions they desire to hold, but that's all they can do. The denomination can't make the church change their teaching, it can't fire the pastor, and it can't seize the property. American Baptist Churches USA, regional and state jurisdictions have in fact also expelled churches over homosexuality, but those congregations can still be part of the ABC USA while not being part of the geographical regional body. Regional bodies can also choose to simply allow same-sex marriage, or they can leave the denomination themselves, like the Pacific Southwest region did, leaving the American Baptist churches in 2005. They formed their own denomination called Transformation Ministries, which recently rebranded to Aspire Network. Today,
Okay, so part of what happens here is polity matters. So there's a few different things to take a look at. One is in terms of how many of these churches appear and what you will find if you go to a service. The theological distinctives that have mattered within Protestantism between these groups for the last 500 years are in some ways going away. Baptism, infant baptism, adult baptism, no big deal. And so there's sort of a monoculture developing among the mainline churches. And people sort of sense that. You can see it in the language we use. Now, I pointed this out on Voices, and a friend of mine said, yeah, but aren't the big box non-denominational and big box denominational churches doing the same thing? Isn't there a monoculture developing among them? And it was like, yeah. Part of the argument that I've been making is that increasingly confessionality is within the realm of prophylicity on websites. These are things that are presented to people as consumer options. They are, and I'm sure someone has already developed a web engine whereby you can sit down and say, oh, here's 30 theological questions, let me answer them, and it will pick the denomination for you. And what's interesting is that even if such a thing exists, it probably doesn't work well for people. Why? Because the way these propositions sort of function and the way people actually, where people actually go and what people actually do, don't often connect that well. I remember in the late 1990s, early aughts, when I got to Northern California, there were a number of Christian Reformed churches in the Valley that were sort of panicking because big box, either non-denominational or big box seeker outfits that had denominations behind them were being planted, and they were attracting often many of the young families because the young families wanted expressive music, jeans preaching, skinny jeans preaching. I just saw that the Pope today said, 8-minute homilies. Well, in many of these places, you have fairly long worship services and fairly long sermons. One of the interesting things that you'll note between sort of high church tends to have longer sermons, half hour to 45 minutes. High church tends to have smaller sermons, 20 minutes down to 8 minutes. And part of this is the whole ethos of Protestantism. In fact, I was thinking about Protestantism today because even just the kind of confidence that we have in someone talking a long time at you, full of admonitions about the way things should or shouldn't be, and this being embraced as an implicit way of influencing, communicating, or basically shaping the world, shaping people's minds. This all, in some ways, really got going from the Protestant Reformation. It doesn't mean it wasn't there before, because, of course, as I've mentioned in my rough drafts for Sundays recently, that the book of Acts is a book of sermons. Certainly there is a lot of preaching. The Reformation, the Protestant Reformation doesn't get this from no place. But the emphasis, I made this point at last year's Breakwater Conference, where the Orthodox focus on the liturgy, the Catholics focus on the Eucharist, the Protestants focus on preaching, and usually music. And, well, the question's going to be, now that things are sort of coming together, what's it going to be? So it's interesting how Protestantism is sort of being divided into two massive monocultures. Now, there's lots of fringes to this. And there are plenty of Protestant denominations that are very excited and sometimes uptight and very particular about different aspects of theology. And part of what goes on in this little corner is, well, many of those distinctives we've sort of demoted. We'll talk about them and we can debate them. But for the most part, that's not what's going on. And so the sort of the split in Protestantism, at least in America, into two larger monocultures is very interesting. And then, of course, you have the question, well, what's going on in the Catholic and Orthodox Church? And it seems in Catholicism and Orthodoxy, their differentiation is increasingly over liturgy, perhaps more than doctrine. Because, again, I've noted before in a previous video that it's very interesting that hell is sort of sliding off the menu in terms of the forefront of churches in America. Back in the towards the end of the 20th century, D. James Kennedy, coming out of Coral Ridge, Florida, developed an evangelism technique that was called evangelism explosion. And the way that worked was you're supposed to knock on people's doors, and then you're supposed to ask them, if you were to die tonight, and right there, when you ask that question, you can tell how much the culture has changed. Because someone today might be smacked or sued or accused of some sort of microaggression if you knocked on someone's door and say, if you were to die tonight, how dare you say I'm going to die? Even though all of us sort of know we're all going to die. If you were to die tonight, what would you say to Jesus to have him let you into his heaven? And that question, and that question was effective. I mean, this evangelism program was not rolled out and basically promoted across evangelical lines. I really don't think the mainliners picked up on it too much. But basically, fear and anxiety about hell was the dominant pitch to sort of convince people that, well, maybe you should go to church, because maybe if you go to church, when you die, you'll get to go to heaven instead of hell. You can see how much the culture has changed from that point. I don't see, someone probably has done surveys on it, but my guess is that the number of Americans who live in existential fear of hell is very low. My guess is that as they get older, both because of residues from the previous culture and because people are getting closer to that age, then they'll think about it more. But it's very interesting how the conversation has shifted. And I just put out that video today. Now, interestingly enough, you might have gotten one of 3 thumbnails, because Google has been rolling out thumbnail A and B testing. And I thought, oh, this could be fun. So for the video that I released today on Wednesday early in the morning, I had 3 different thumbnails for it. And I personally sort of like the second thumbnail, because I like the whole sanctuary full of dogs and carrots and sticks. The sticks wind up looking like straw. They didn't really look like good sticks. But the third thumbnail was really interesting, because you basically have the dog trainer look just like the dog, which I thought had a sort of a deep symbolic resonance with the video that I created. And apparently the third thumbnail is a bit more preferred compared to the first and the second. Now, YouTube is going to run this test for 15 days, and at the end of 15 days, I should get a sense of which thumbnail was more effective, which I'm not exactly sure how that's going to help me, because what am I going to go? I make so many videos. I also, because of this, I wound up looking at some YouTube videos that were talking about it, and then some of these things like YouTube Buddy and vidIQ that are supposed to help you gain a really big following and be successful about making money on YouTube. And I learned that I'm doing it all wrong. So that's why I'm such a failed YouTuber. And I know some of you will say, yeah, but your channel is bigger than mine. And I think the truth is that we're using YouTube differently. And if you didn't watch Clara's conversation with Grim Grizz, you are missing out, because that was an amazing conversation. I loved that conversation. Anyway, back to the point that I was making that has almost escaped from my mind. Oh yeah, I was talking about hell. The religious consciousness of the United States has changed dramatically, to the point that even someone as generically evangelical and conservative as the ancient Egypt guy didn't really make a big dent in it at all. And even the rush to Eastern Orthodoxy can fit into this, because of course many who have sort of gone that way, it's an alternative, let's say, to the Mainline, because you still don't necessarily have to embrace any kind of doctrine about hell. You can think of eventual reconciliation and ideas like this, which of course have been in Orthodoxy for a very, very long time. But it's just interesting the way that religious assumptions that are popular in the culture have continued to migrate and how the various religious organizations have responded to it. Of course, some have gotten reactive. Westboro Baptist doubled down. Others have just sort of softly, quietly, I really doubt there's any church is getting any kind of traction. Maybe it's just so countercultural now they could, using evangelism explosion in their local neighborhood. I'm sort of halfway wondering if there's a copy of Evangelism Explosion still in the church library, because church libraries wind up being repositories of all sorts of programs and projects that denominations often have sort of recommended to churches for churches to somehow grow and be more effective, yada, yada, yada. Now, part of the difficulty that a bunch of us on the corner are sort of waiting for the release of all of the video from the 29-hour live stream that they wound up doing, because even Grim Grizz, who said some rather skeptical things about that project, noted that there's actually a ton of really good stuff that happened in that very long live stream. And there are sort of rumors in the corner about this conversation and that conversation, but we can't quite access that conversation yet. Word is that there, in fact, are recorded copies of that conversation from Twitter, because they simultaneously streamed it to Twitter, and Twitter kept it all so they can download it and they can chop it into segments that YouTube will allow them to upload, and then they'll upload those videos, and then the Reapers can get in there and begin to take things from it, because I know some sections that I very much want to explore in that video. And one of those was our friend Joseph, who was training to become a deacon in the Orthodox Church, because we were talking about basically how Orthodoxy in America is going to change. I talked a minute ago about how you have a monoculture developing in the mainline, or what's left of the mainline. And then you have this monoculture that's developed in evangelicalism. And again, there are fringes to both, but that many of the things that have divided these churches, and that these churches have sort of tussled with each other over the last 500 years, is sort of going away. And now we have Orthodoxy coming on the scene in America, and Joseph has been quite more open than many about the fact that, well, there's a crisis of leadership in Orthodoxy, not in terms of conflicts between leadership necessarily, but rather, if Orthodoxy is going to grow at the pace that the internet seems to be feeding them Orthodox curious persons, that they're going to need sort of a massive rollout of new priests. And unlike a lot of Protestant traditions where you can sort of make a minister with a Bible and a little bit of goodwill and maybe some natural giftedness of gift of gab and maybe a little bit of theological education, that's not the deal with the Orthodox. And they're going to have some real challenges coming up. Now you'll get, I deeply appreciate and respect these guys for having this kind of open conversation, because there's no reason to not have it in the open, and I just admire their honesty and their integrity for doing it. And you don't have to go very far into the video to see what's going on. And if talk to our friend Joseph here in the corner, he'll say, yeah, and it's probably even worse.
Friends, Christ is risen. He truly is risen. I am back now with my good friend Matthew Namey, and we're going to have a conversation about something else this time. Today, we're talking about the Orthodox clergy crisis. Matthew Namey is the executive director of the Orthodox Studies Institute at St. Constantine College, which you can find out more about at orthodoxstudies.org. And he is also, this is probably what he's much better known for, the editor-in-chief of orthodoxhistory.org. And one of the offerings available on the Orthodox Studies website is a study of the current and growing shortage of Orthodox clergy in the United States. And that's what we're here to talk about today. So welcome back, Matthew, to my YouTube channel. It's good to have you.
Thanks, Father.
So, so let's tell us a little bit about the study. When was it conducted?
So last year, mostly over the summer last year, We gathered data from various jurisdictions, dioceses, covering hundreds of Orthodox parishes in the United States across several of most of the major jurisdictions, to try to understand. What we were trying to determine was how many parishes are expected to need a new priest and not have zero priests and will need a new one over the coming 5-year period. That was the intent of the study.
Yeah. So, all right. Well, why don't you tell us a little bit about it? And I should, by the way, note for everybody that, especially if you're watching this on YouTube, there's going to be a link to the study in the notes on the YouTube video, so you can go read it for yourself.
I'll put a link to this video, as I usually do for any of the videos that I refer to. I'll put a link to the video down below so you can. They go an hour and a half, and I'm just only going to play 10 minutes. So if you want to hear the rest of the conversation, if you're interested in the topic, by all means, go to the video and listen to the whole thing.
But so what are we seeing? Like, give me the basic shock numbers to start out with, because if someone reads the study, it is kind of shocking. Actually,
yeah,
I think a lot of people
disturbing.
Don't know. Like, I would say bishops are aware that this is a problem, right? As they're trying to staff parishes. A lot of clergy are probably aware that this is a problem. Parishes that are looking at pastoral transitions might be becoming aware that this is a problem, but I think probably most lay people do not even know that this is a problem. So, like, lay it out for me. What's the stuff that is going to get us excited?
So the big number is, well, one of the big numbers is that 25% of Orthodox parishes in the United States will need a new priest over the next 5 years.
Okay.
25% of them. So there's different ways.
Now, again, for some people that might not sound like a huge number. 5 years? 5 years comes fast. That's a big number. 25%? And it's not just the Orthodox that are in a bind with respect to this. The Christian Reformed Church has its own clergy shortage. The Christian Reformed Church has been talking about this for 20 years, partly just because of the demographic cycle and because so many baby boomers became ministers. And then there's been I'd say, generally speaking, in the culture, there's been a short perceived status of clergy has basically continued to go down, which sort of disincentivizes people to actually get into the ministry.
We could look at this, but basically we ask people in decision-making roles, bishops, chancellors, that kind of thing. How many of your parishes that you're responsible for are going to need a new priest in the next 5 years, and there's nobody else at the parish? There's no other priests at the parish, and it's 25%, right? You can add to that, and I don't think people think about this, there's actually depositions, right? Priests being defrocked or laicized happens at a pretty steady rate
for various reasons. For various reasons. Some it's, that they leave the priesthood because they're done. They just don't want to do it anymore, or they were widowed and they want to remarry, or they did something that was unbecoming of a priest.
So this point is an important one too, because again, the Roman Catholics and the Orthodox have their own particular challenges in this because, of course, Catholicism requires celibacy. Orthodoxy, you can go into the priesthood and be married, but in many cases, if your spouse dies, you're not supposed to remarry. And I don't know the ins and outs of that, but ask somebody. Just put it in YouTube. I'm sure there's a video out there that explains it.
All kinds of possibilities for laicizations, depositions.
Exactly. And they tend to happen at as best I could tell with the data, a pretty steady rate. So once you combine those numbers, we're over 25%.
Okay.
Which is one thing, right? Aging clergy population, that kind of thing.
Sure.
Okay, fine.
Jobs need to be filled. This is understandable.
The scary thing is we're running a very large deficit. We're not producing enough new clergy, anywhere close to enough new clergy to offset the number that are leaving. Either they're retiring or, they're going to pass away because of old age, or they're...
Now, some might say, well, with all the interest in Orthodoxy, surely there'll be an uptick in people desiring to go into the priesthood. And I'm sure that there will be. But will it be a sufficient uptick to actually fill the gap? Because going into the ministry, and especially I would imagine going into the priesthood, is not like going into any other job. There is a fair amount of education that is required. In Catholicism, obviously, there is celibacy that is required. So you're basically taking a certain life path and trajectory off the table. If, in fact, you are married already and going into the priesthood and Orthodoxy, your wife had better be on board. And, clergy have talked about these kinds of issues forever. Protestants have talked about these kinds of issues forever because in many cases, it is not like getting just a job in another corporation where all these sort of American traditions about you're the employee, not your spouse. Obviously, some of the details about your job are going to impact your spouse in some ways. But if you're a clergy spouse, there is a whole world of things that comes along with this. At Calvin College, I remember there are always a few girls out there that were really interested in marrying clergy. But those you could probably count, those were tiny, tiny percentages. There are far more girls, sometimes they were children of clergy, who were like, I would never marry a minister. Well, why? Well, in the Christian Reformed Church, a lot of what that meant often, especially 40, 50 years ago, well, you're going to live in a parsonage, you're not going to own a home, and you're going to move around a while. Now, a lot of this stuff has changed. So you're going to live in your own home. You're going to move around a lot. You're really not going to be able to have a career because, at least in the old days, 50, 60 years ago in the CRC, you'd be moving around a lot. So you couldn't keep a career. Or maybe if you were a nurse or often Christian school teacher. So if you'd hop from one place to another. But basically part of what has slowed down the movement of clergy in the Christian Reformed Church is spousal occupation. Part of it is that while nobody would ever get rich being a Christian Reformed minister, just the way sort of salaries went in the 50s and 60s, you could support a household living in a parsonage on a single family income. And clergy salaries really haven't sort of kept up, just like in general salaries haven't kept up. And so then pretty quickly you realize that, well, if you're going to be a minister, your spouse is probably going to have to work. And increasingly, if you want decent medical benefits, your spouse is going to have to work because denominational medical benefits, which used to be quite good, really aren't very good anymore just because of the way medical insurance works. And so it's almost become, in many Protestant places, assumed that the family is functionally bivocational, and that the pastor's clergy and benefits and retirement benefits, now I'm looking more seriously at retirement benefits because it's 7 or so years away, and it's like, yeah, that minister's pension from the denomination, not a lot of money. And I compare the minister's pension, and then you add some Social Security, still not a lot of money. And the idea is, well, I hope you've saved up during and have a good 403B built up because you're going to need that money to supplement. And if you lived in a parsonage, so about 20 years ago, there were a whole bunch of churches that basically the minister said, look, maybe I want to buy the parsonage, maybe I want a housing allowance instead of a parsonage. And a lot of churches did that basically to keep their clergy. And well, now these churches don't have parsonages anymore, and so that when a minister sort of retires or leaves, especially if they live in a high income area or a high real estate value area, someplace like the Bay Area, they can't even attract another minister because they don't have a place for that person to live. And if they're, let's say, graduating from Calvin Seminary and they've got a wife in tow and a couple of kids, and they're going to be paying them $70,000, $80,000 a year, there's no way they're going to live in the San Francisco Bay Area on that kind of income. Unless maybe they're living in a parsonage, and so that money has to basically cover food. Well, if they're living in a parsonage, the salary might only be $50,000 or $60,000 a year. And that's after 4 years of education. My guess is for the Orthodox, the financial aspects are even poorer. That would be my guess because, well, while there are some big thriving Orthodox churches out there, my guess is that these guys with robes and beards and chains probably are making less money than, well, other people in other places, especially if they're running a little storefront church. And now, on one hand, the people of the congregation will esteem you because of it, because, wow, he's really suffering for the Lord, because we can't really afford to pay him very much money. Yeah, and a lot of wives look at that and say, well, so in other words, I have to subsidize your vocational thing, and I have to give birth, and I have to show up and be sort of a model woman in the church, and I have to mind the children, and. You know, to one degree at least, the Roman Catholic system, you don't have wives and children in tow. For the Orthodox, well, good news is you don't have to be celibate. You can have lots of children. Bad news is you're still going to have to afford these children. And is that Orthodox parish really going to be able to afford it? And the fact that, again, my impression is to become an Orthodox priest, you need a lot of preparation. And the way at least Orthodoxy has been sold on the internet, you know, a lot of pastoral close contact with your parish. Part of what happened in the Seeker Church movement is that pastors became ranchers, not gardeners. Well, what do I mean by that? Well, the idea was you want to grow your church big, so you have multiple staff positions, and then you have small groups in the church. And for the most part, for 80% of the pastoral care in the church, the members are supposed to do it with each other. Whereas the old parish models tended to be the minister does all of the pastoral care. In the beginning of the 20th century and through the middle of the 20th century, when the predominant model in the Christian Reformed Church was a solo pastorate, often the wife was assumed to maybe provide music, maybe do vacation Bible school, basically lend a hand in a lot of things in the church. And the pastor was supposed to preach 2 sermons a Sunday, teach all the catechism, do all the visiting, and basically do everything in the church. And still at that point, many of the families were one job, not dual income families, single income families. So wives could often run VBS and things like that. And so the entire church scene has changed. And this is so we've got sort of dueling monocultures in Protestantism. And then we have, on one hand, a very noticeable clergy shortage in the Roman Catholic Church. Many Catholic churches try to import clergy from the developing world. Now, if you're clergy in the developing world, getting sent to the United States, probably an upgrade in some ways, because there's just in the developing world, it's different. Orthodoxy, apart from this video and some other things that I watch, wow, challenging. And so not only do they have to train all these people, they have to recruit people that you might say, wow, Orthodoxy is sort of a steep slope religion. If you want to be Orthodox, you know, you have a long period of where you have to be a catechumen. You might not get let into the church. They have serious positions about authority, so you have to listen to your priest. You're expected to go to confession. And part of what's driving people to Orthodoxy is that the desire of that steep slope, you know, it's, you know, let's be really serious about our Christianity and let's do it that way. Well, you're going to need clergy that are going to have to be available and are going to have to make this work not only in terms of wanting to do the job. So they're not only into steep slope becoming Orthodox, they're into steep slope being an Orthodox priest. They're going to be the example. They're going to be the model. They're going to be the ones to wear the robes. They're going to be the ones to wear the chains. They're going to be the ones to do all this work and pay for it, and family. And so this crisis isn't just a crisis of, let's say, ramping up institutions. This is a crisis of recruiting people for that very demanding thing. And again, as in contrasting to various Protestant groups, that some of which have near zero educational requirements, and the fact that during the Seeker movement, number of studies in evangelicalism noted that clergy theological education was a negative indicator of the capacity to grow a church generally speaking, during the seeker movement, you wanted to grow your church plant above 200 in the first 2 years of its existence, and then up from there. And basically, theological distinctiveness was a negative indicator. And so in the 80s and 90s, Protestant clergy were really pushed to read business books and to treat the church like a business, and to do surveys and to have customer service, have a customer service mindset, so that churchgoers could feel satisfied with their decision to join Church A rather than Church B.
They're going to be deposed. We're running a big deficit, which the result of that's parishes that don't have a priest to serve the services, or short-staffed parishes where the priest can't effectively minister to the whole community because there aren't enough priests in the community that's larger.
Yeah. So what kind of deficit are we looking at? Like, so if about 25% of parishes are going to need, or more, are going to need a new priest within the next 5 years, like how many priests is that roughly? And then how many are we ordaining? Or
our deficit, so the deficit is 115 parishes per year. So there's about 2,000 canonical Orthodox parishes in the United States. About 115 parishes per year are going.
Now, to give you a little indication of size here, said 2,000 canonical Orthodox parishes, and I'm assuming, and correct me if I'm wrong in the comment section, basically what that means of all the various types of Orthodox churches in America: Greek Orthodox, Antiochian Orthodox, Russian Orthodox, Ukrainian Orthodox, Romanian Orthodox, and then American Orthodox, the Orthodox Church of America, or I forget exactly what it's called. You take all of those together, you have 2,000 churches or 2,000 parishes. You want to know how many Christian Reformed churches there are? Now, a lot of you, when you came to this channel, you maybe if you lived in a place like Grand Rapids or Chicago or even Toronto, perhaps, you might have heard of the Christian Reformed Church. The vast majority of you will have never heard of the Christian Reformed Church. There are 1,000 Christian Reformed churches in the U.S. and Canada. Now, Orthodox churches tend to be a lot more visible because they usually invest money in their buildings. And this conversation doesn't even talk about, on one hand, you need all these clergy. On the other hand, you really want, unlike a Protestant church where you can basically use a strip mall, churches that say start as Orthodox in a strip mall, they have aspirations to, like this church that we visited in Riverside after the Chino conference, they have aspirations to have $1 million just in stone flooring, and to bring carved elements from the old world. And you can find that video of the tour that we were given. Jonathan Peugeot was there. Father, I forget his name right now, but he's a big YouTuber, and he even I really want a video of this guy before he became an Orthodox priest, because that accent, I don't know where that accent comes from. It's not an American accent, and he's not an immigrant, so I'm not exactly sure about the way he talks. Anyway, but he was clearly very proud about the carved wooden doors and the $1 million in stone for the flooring and the this and the that and the this and the that. And as a Protestant pastor, I walked in this room, and now granted that a lot of people stand, and then standing people kind of flow out the door. I get that, but I was looking at this room thinking, you can't hold a lot of people in this room. If you walk into, let's say, the worship space at Willow Creek, where you can seat 5,000 people, this was a pretty significant Orthodox church in Riverside, California. Square footage wise, at least of the worship space, not a lot bigger than Little Living Stones. Now, a lot costlier, but not a lot bigger. I mean, plain church Protestant. Actually, there was a guy in our denomination who was an engineer, Harold Camping, and Harold Camping actually was one of the guys that built this place. And he made his money building highways in Northern California. And I've had plenty of people who've come and tried to work on things and cut through these walls. And it's like, what he did was use the same stuff as highways, and he put it up this way. So these walls are, you're going to ruin a lot of Sawzall blades in them. But so scaling, orthodoxy to meet the internet demand, and the fact that he's saying we have a deficit each year, chances are, unless you can sort of ramp up and fulfill this deficit, a yearly deficit over 10 years compounds.
Are going to need a new priest and will not be able to have one. That's the deficit.
Wow. So that means that, like, if things continue as they are, that within 20 years, Orthodoxy in America will have no clergy, basically, or so few that it will be crippled, utterly crippled.
What the effect of this is going to be, you're going to have understaffed parishes. You're going to have it's going to have a chilling effect on the creation of new missions, because if you don't have enough priests, you can't add more parishes, right? There are parts of the country where Orthodoxy is absolutely booming. We have another study about to come out on converts and what are the numbers around converts to Orthodoxy.
And we'll be talking about that in a future video, everybody, by the way.
So we're having a convert surge at a time when we're running a deficit. We're going to have a priest shortage, right? So we can't start the missions, do the kind of relationships that need to be built for new people coming into the church with their clergy. That's all going to be much more difficult if we don't have enough clergy.
Yeah. So, like, how many new priests would we need within the next 5 years just to staff the openings that are going to come? To say nothing about new openings, like with new parishes or whatever.
So we need 575 new priests over the next 5 years. And seminary MDiv graduates, I misspoke earlier about the deficit. It's slightly lower, but seminary MDiv graduates, which is the primary source of our priests at this stage in the United States, at least, seminary MDiv graduates, we're talking, I'll give you some numbers. St. Vlad's at this point is producing about 8 male Eastern Orthodox sort of ordainable MDiv graduates per year. St. Tikhon's is producing about 9 per year on average. Holy Cross is in the same range. So those are the 3 main Orthodox seminaries. And we're talking about collectively, and then you add in some of the other smaller ones, maybe 30 a year, right? But we need 115 per year. Wow. So, right, we're running this big deficit. Now, immigration helps a little bit, right? You have immigrant clergy coming in, but it's not going to make up that shortfall.
So basically, we're producing a little more than 1/4 of the priests that we need in order just to keep things where they are now.
Correct. Now, that does not account for understaffed parishes that aren't necessarily going to have a vacancy, but they're understaffed. And it doesn't account for new missions. So when you add those in, which I think we should, but I don't have those numbers, it actually the numbers are actually worse.
Yeah. So when, what does a clergy shortage look like on the ground, right? Number one, it'll be a parish where the priest dies or retires or is deposed. He's gone for some reason, and they can't get a replacement, right? They might have some retired guy that comes in once in a while, or maybe there's nobody. Maybe they're doing reader services, or maybe they close the parish, right? That's one effect. Another one is what you just mentioned, is like that some parishes are underserved. We can see this happening now, where you've got a parish that, for instance, might have hundreds of families, or maybe 1,000 families or something, right? So if you imagine, like, there's about 3 people per family, roughly, is kind of way that works out, because a single person is regarded as a family unit generally, but also like a family with, parents and children it's about 3 people per family unit. So, like, if you have 1,000 families in a parish, that's 3,000 people roughly. And let's say you've got 3 priests at that parish. It's pretty well staffed, right? Each one of those people is responsible for 1,000 souls. Each one of those priests. Or even let's say it's 500 family parish. Again, this is a big parish by Orthodox standards. That's 1,500 people. Each one of those 3 priests is responsible for 500 souls. But the reality is there are parishes out there that have that many families and one priest, right? So he's responsible for thousands of people. Um, and there's, what is it called? The Dunbar number.
Yes.
What is that? What is this? Because it's very relevant to this question.
Yeah, so the Dunbar number basically it's a sociological phenomenon
Okay.
that's been observed in populations, different populations of humans. That is essentially the number of relationships that a person can maintain, as I understand it. So it's about
Okay.
150 is around
100,
roughly the number.
150 relationships. So,
Right. So there is data. There is data. There's some evidence that. So if you look at attendance rates at Orthodox parishes, Alexei Krindach did some work on this several years ago. If you look at attendance rates at Orthodox parishes, there's a kind of there's a linear decline in attendance until you hit the rate, right, like the percentage of people that show up on a regular basis, until you hit the Dunbar number. And once you get to the Dunbar number, the parish is big enough that it gets to the Dunbar number, there is a non-linear decline in the rate of attendance. So that suggests that people are more disconnected from the community as the community.
So we're only 11 minutes into this video, and I'm not going to stay for the whole thing. But they're raising all of the issues, and what's interesting to me is that the commonalities, even though there are large distinctives between Orthodox, Catholic, Protestant, or even non-Christian religions and how they do things, people don't appreciate how deeply, especially evangelicals, have studied sociologically church dynamics. And so Dunbar numbers. And so part of what happened in the 80s and 90s during the seeker movement, when the goal was to produce these large megachurches, well, how do you do this? Well, you staff up for it. Well, how many of those staffers actually have MDivs? Well, probably not too many, because MDivs, they're kind of costly. They're kind of hard to come by. Then you have other staffers. But basically what you do is, in Protestant churches, you ramp up lay leadership, and you divide people into small groups. And you very quickly begin to realize that, well, you certainly do want people coming to your service. And so then you have good music and good childcare, and of course, all of this requires staffing, and so then you build into the church an ethos of service, and just look at something like Saddleback Church, because what churches did in the seeker movement was really refine this kind of thing to a science, and I mean science, and you have all of these management metrics to manage all of these things, but the key was you need both big and small, and you have to sort of work the sizes, and again, you're pastor of your 10, 15, 20,000 member megachurch, you're never going to have lunch with that pastor. You're going to be in a small group, and you're going to have a small group leader, and you're probably not even going to know your district elder or something like this. I mean, and so there's just a world of different ecclesiology in all of these things. Okay. Now let's go back to the point of this video. What has been causing this? Why are these churches that, well, okay, Presbyterians, they sort of came from England and Scotland. Episcopalians, they came from England. American Baptists, well, they came out of the frontier. United Methodists, they came out of the Methodist movement, also from England. Lutherans came out of Germany and Scandinavia. United Church of Christ, don't really know their background. Christian Church, Disciples of Christ, another frontier church, no creed but Christ. All of these theological distinctions that had been maintained for centuries, and in fact had been maintained well into the 20th century, and in the late 20th century, it's all starting to go away. Why? First, mass media, and increasingly the internet. Increasingly, larger and larger percentage of churches, the people who are coming to church, their Christian formation is done by the media. So here's a video about same-sex marriage. Same-sex marriage is the largest religious transformation that didn't start in any church. It comes through the media. So Will and Grace are bishops of that movement. And one of the things that you begin to notice as a pastor is that when there's a divisive issue like same-sex marriage or any, again, of these issues that have not been formed confessionally in the overall tussle of the churches as they came out of. So a friend of mine on CRC Voices, David Snapper, when he was doing his THM, decided to read like every editorial written in the Christian Reform banner before the Second World War. And before the Second World War, the great threat seen by leadership in the Christian Reformed Church had nothing to do with human sexuality. It was Methodism. The Christian Reformed Church was going to try really hard to not succumb to the overall prevalent Methodism in American culture, and we had to stay distinctly Reformed. Christian Reformed Church has not worried about Methodism for a very long time. I'll just say it that way. Our fights are no longer all of these doctrinal fights. Now, with most of these churches, I think it's easily arguable that the drop-off of successive generations, the Xers, the millennials, that the baby boomers in some ways were saved by the Jesus movement. The Jesus movement radically transformed, launched the seeker movement, launched contemporary music, sort of gave Protestantism that in the 90s began to adopt the new sound for churches, and the new inspirational sound for churches gave those churches a fighting chance at retaining their youth. And then you had Christian rock music and all of those kinds of things. But again, that whole movement was a homogenizing of the Protestant churches. And of course, the Catholic had sort of their own aspect to it. All of that was happening. This new orthodoxy, the Peterson-Peugeot pipeline, people are being formed. They're choosing orthodoxy through the internet. And this internet formation is going to have consequences far beyond what any of us can imagine, because it always does. In the 1930s, if you would say, all of these mainline churches that are competing with each other over Calvinism versus Arminianism, and these fights remain on YouTube, but they're religious nerds that are fighting. And for the most part, most people are going to go to church, or at least if they're going to convince their spouse to go with them, they're going to care about the music, the friendliness, the charisma of the pastor. Great example could be Mark Driscoll. Mark Driscoll, of course, basically gets kicked out of the church he planted in Seattle, goes down to Arizona, sets up camp again, and via the internet can once again grow a large church. Even though The Rise and Fall of Mars Hill, one of the most successful religious podcasts that has been out over the last few years, basically gave him a drubbing. But far larger things are forming Christians. And it's going to be very interesting to see how this goes with large monoculture churches where predominantly the formation is happening from YouTubers like me. Or Christian YouTube, who's, being YouTubers and influencers online. It used to be in the late 20th century, it was the writers and the authors and the really successful writers. I mean, Tim Keller, Eugene Peterson in the evangelical space, and there's just whole reams of them. And then there's, depending on sort of the niches, dispensationalism, of course, had the Left Behind series, all of this stuff happening. My guess is that is all going away. For a while in the aughts, there were sort of magazine writers and bloggers. Now the YouTubers are going to be the dominant shapers of churches. And the fights are going to be shaping the church. And we're seeing this in the Christian Reformed Church. Because on one hand, the confessionalists want to sort of drill down on the confessions, but it's not going to work. Because, well, the Christian Reformed Church has been able to basically hold the line on infant baptism up until this point. But other churches that started out with strong positions on infant baptism, like the Reformed Church in America, many Reformed Church in America churches that I worked with in a joint project being the CRC and the RCA that I would visit, these churches were indistinguishable from large non-denominational megachurches. The Protestant the evangelical Protestant monoculture, basically, that's what they were. Now, with wokeism, you have the mainline monoculture. The question for Orthodoxy is, what kind of monoculture will come from the Peterson-Peugeot pipeline? Things are going to get even more interesting. So leave a comment. Let me know what you think.